All right. Well, let's hello everyone who's online out there. Let's get started. Uh, so before we get off, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us and just maybe walk through a few housekeeping notes as people kind of filter in here. So one, we've disabled mics and cameras for participants just to support bandwidth and for the best user experience. It will be recorded and we will post it on MyCMPA. So kind of the format for this is it's intended to be a fireside chat, which is why Tricia kind of made a joke about the fireplace background. So a bit more of a conversation. And so what I would encourage you to do is I'll be monitoring the chat and the questions. And so if you have a question based on the conversation we're having, throw it up there and we'll see if we can't kind of integrate it into our conversation. So please just ask questions throughout, as Amy said. And then we'll try and integrate it in. And then depending on how it goes, either we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A, or if we're able to answer people's questions as we go, we'll just kind of go to the full hour. So that is the plan. And there's still more clicks coming in, but I think what we'll do is we'll get started on the formal beginning of this. So before I introduce our wonderful speaker, I would like to acknowledge that I am streaming to you live from the territory that was never ceded or given up to the Crown by the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. This is out in the area known as the Lower Mainland of British Columbia. And the term unceded acknowledges the disposition of the land and inherent rights of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people to hold the territory. The other piece that I would like to recognize is that our offices are on the lands and unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. And so we know that our work and partnerships extend across Turtle Island, also known as North America, from coast to coast to coast. And so we must acknowledge and remember the relationship between the Indigenous peoples and the land across the country that we all share. And so we also recognize that we have a role in reconciliation. And the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission included a call to action to reclaim recognition of Indigenous peoples and the land, and recognition is an important step towards that. So we understand that doing these acknowledgements is only one step in an ongoing effort towards reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada, and we'll continue to explore how we can support reconciliation as we move forward. With that, I am delighted. I'm so excited to introduce our speaker today. This is the very first in a series of guest speakers that we're having at the CMPA, put on by the wonderful organizational, the OLC group. And our speaker today is Juliette Powell. We're going to be talking about AI literacy today, and data literacy and AI. And Juliette's focus on the responsible deployment of AI, ethical data exploration, as well as the search and removal of biases in data and potentially in AI, are going to be topics that we're going to talk through. Her combined knowledge from her research at Columbia University, her work with multinational companies like Intel Labs and government institutions are going to provide a really unique and interesting perspective for our conversation. Her latest book, which you can see in the background there, The AI Dilemma, 7 Principles for Responsible Technology, has a number of principles that resonate with us today. Yeah, thank you for that. And so we're going to be going back to these principles throughout our conversation. And what I'm so excited about the timing of this is we are looking at improving our own data literacy within the organization and launching some formal sort of programs and initiatives throughout 2024 and even this year to do that. So without further ado, we're so happy to have you here, Juliette. Maybe I'll hand it over to you, and we can get our virtual fireside chat started.
Lovely, and thank you so much to you, Chantz, to the entire organization, and to everybody who actually showed up today. I know that you all have work to do, and you had the option of showing up and not showing up. For those of you who are watching us after the fact, Well, thank you for paying attention. Thank you for listening in. And hopefully, as a larger community, we can all learn from each other. That's what I'm hoping here, Chaz.
Great. So maybe what we'll start is maybe kind of your background and how you got involved in this area, and sort of your perspectives on that.
Sure. Well, I'm very fortunate. I grew up in Canada, and I started coding when I was very young, and then I got into this incredible television career because I saw somebody on TV doing an interview, and it was so bad that I thought, okay, if they can do that, then I can do something too. And I was lucky that a few people believed in me. But one of the wonderful things about working at a tiny television station in Canada is that you have access, or at least back in the day, you had access to a lot of the data that was coming in. Most of it was being collected for and by advertisers and advertising departments, but there was also a direct correlation between how the data was being used to begin to create programming. In this case, we were talking about live programming. So from the get-go, I was always fascinated between that connection, what the data was informing in terms of programming, in terms of whether advertisers were willing to support or not support, but also in terms of Canadian content and how the government was looking at this data to determine whether the television networks were fulfilling their Canadian obligations. Fast forward to when I moved to the United States, which was after 9/11, and I started noticing that the social graph, social data from social networks also had a huge role to play in people's ability to find information quickly, in navigating the internet, in finding resources when they had ideas to want to build businesses. I also noticed that, the social data was being leveraged by politicians in the case of Obama. And so because I noticed that, I was able to predict that Obama was going to win the first time, which I think came to a surprise to many people in the world. And then fast forward even further, you mentioned my work with Intel Labs. I was lucky enough while I was still in Toronto to be asked to help produce the TED conference. And as a result, again, I had the opportunity to meet some incredible thought leaders, newsmakers from all over the world, and realize that technology that I had seen, through all of the different instances that I just mentioned, was now being leveraged in completely different ways. So for Intel Labs, I was tasked, along with an amazing team that also came from the TED conference, to essentially map the personal data ecosystem on a global level, with the understanding that the more people that have access to digital infrastructure, have data literacy skills, have digital trust, but also they had to have access to electricity, right? The most basic and fundamental things. The more we were able to really nourish these four grand challenges simultaneously, the more likely more people in the world would have access and control to their own personal data. And understanding that that also meant that the systems that we're deploying using artificial intelligence would also have access to that personal data in order to compute whatever it is that different organizations and governments were trying to do. So that's a very long answer to your question, but it's been a journey. It's been a wonderful, wonderful adventure. And I feel so grateful to be alive at this particular moment in time.
Well, I mean, there's certainly a lot of change and a lot of, most recently, I mean, even when we were planning this, I don't think anyone had kind of ChatGPT as being as big as it ended up being. So interesting how you kind of found your way through this, kind of starting with, starting coding young, and maybe that's where we'll start. The kind of the question around so data literacy. I think we did a survey here. About 79% of employees at the CMPA want to improve their data literacy, but it can be sort of something that's kind of not embarrassing, but kind of difficult, right? To show that maybe your skills aren't up to where you think they should be. Do you have any thoughts on ways that people can kind of improve their data literacy and kind of, you started young, and then you kind of took what you were doing and kind of did it through following kind of a natural curiosity. But through that, is there any sort of advice or thoughts you can give to people who are interested in improving their own data literacy, and starting from very different points, very different spots?
Sure. I mean, honestly, I learned by example. So my mom went back to school, and instead of hiring a babysitter, she took me to university with her at McGill in Montreal, and she was learning how to code. And as a result, I'd sit there and I'd learn with her. And then when we went home, we do the homework together. So I got to learn with my mom, and it was a wonderful bonding experience. And I think that many of us have those opportunities with our children and with our elders as well to ask better questions of our data. I think that one of the things that I learned in front of the camera and television was that many interviewers tend to ask the same questions over and over and over again. And I think it's the same thing when you're a television producer. You're always going to the same people because it's easy. When you're within all kinds of different organizations and even within the government, same thing. You get into this autopilot where you don't necessarily push yourself to ask better questions. But the truth is that if you've collected really high quality data across multiple different variables, then the better the questions, the better the responses you're going to have. And you don't have to limit yourself to just asking the same old questions, which means that we need more people asking better questions. And that I learned from a very, very young age. My professors at school were always like, what do you want? Why are you always asking questions? Well, because I was curious, because I wanted to know more. And I think that, again, when you work within an organization, if the culture is such that you have the psychological safety to ask questions and that you get positive reinforcement for asking those questions, then you want to ask more and you want to learn more and you want to grow more. And the more you see that happening where people are flourishing, more likely that you're going to be more open to doing it. And then the newcomers that are coming into the organization will also feel like this is part of what we do here. We learn together and we ask questions. It's okay to ask questions. And I think that's incredibly important for any organization that is thinking about using tools like artificial intelligence. Also, I want to point out that it has nothing to do, none of this technology has anything to do with age, has anything to do really with affinity for technology if you're well surrounded within the organization. When I first started, again, I started noticing things on my own. I noticed the connections between what was happening with the data that we were collecting and what advertisers were doing. A little bit later on, I noticed that the social graphs that were being used on things like Facebook and Twitter were correlating with how certain candidates were using their profiles and how they were using social media to kind of reach out to people that weren't considered to be voters. So they were asking better questions of the technology, but also of potential voters. And so I encourage all of us to dive in. I mean, there are no bad questions here. In fact, I think that considering the power of artificial intelligence, we all need to be asking better questions of our technology and of ourselves. What do we want to do with this, right? And one of the other things I just want to bring up is that you don't necessarily want to throw AI at everything. And that's a question that I often get. Should I automate this or should we use AI that? And if you can use logic, if you can use a basic logic tree, you don't even need artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is really great at noticing patterns. And we see it, for example, in fraud, right? I get messages saying that my credit card, is that you at that particular gas station, on the other side of the world? Well, no, it's not. And thank you very much, AI, for noticing that that is not me because I'm sitting right here in New York. But at the same time, again, these questions are coming from patterns of fraud. So the better we ask the questions, the better we train our AI to ask questions, the better protected we are in many ways.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting, kind of the concept of do we throw AI at everything, and so I think we're going to go back to that in a second. Mm-hmm. So where I'd love to go is maybe let's do you have any thoughts or advice on what are some ways that people can even ask better questions. We touched a little bit on psychological safety. What does that look like? What are some things that you believe have to be in place for people to feel comfortable to ask questions? Because maybe they think it's a dumb question, but maybe it's the question that people have to ask. So how can we set up an environment so that everyone feels that all questions are welcome and there are no dumb questions? Could you chat about that a little bit?
So I've been lucky enough to consult with several organizations that, in fact, let me go back to Toronto because you're in Canada and I really want to give props to my Canadian roots. I learned most of this stuff in Canada. When I was working at Much Music City TV, Bravo, Musique Plus, one of the things that was central to the culture was that even if your job had nothing to do with producing a television show, you could have been the street sweeper, it didn't matter. If you had an idea for a show, how to make something better, or question why certain things happened, or why potentially people were being harmed or left out or anything, you were valued because you contributed to the whole. And I know that not every organization is like that, but I grew up with that. I grew up with that psychological safety to say everybody's voice is valid and worthy of being heard. And everyone, regardless of their education or where they come from, whatever their socioeconomics, whatever their gender is, even neurodiversity, all of these things are pluses. And so psychological safety means that you're within an organization where when you do ask questions, you are valued, you are rewarded, as opposed to an organization that tells you, no, you don't know enough about that, little girl. And gosh, I've seen that happen a multitude of times. From what I understand from your organization, Chantz, you do offer psychological safety to your employees. And I'm not surprised when you tell me that some people have been there for over 30 years. It really takes a special organization in this day and age to want to stay there for so long. So I suspect you know a thing or two about it.
Well, it's certainly something that we're doing our best to continually kind of grow and do better at, because it seems like you can never be too good at something like this. And so the kind of the idea of essentially the culture, ask a question, how is it valued? So if that's what's going on, how can you have that, and what are the benefits of psychological safety around bringing like the right questions to light? I think in your book you talk a little bit about creative friction. So there, psychological safety might not always be we all get along, but there's something around the friction part. I'm super curious on what that means for you and how that then kind of applies to the use of asking better questions, data, and AI. So I'd like to understand that a little bit better, because sometimes people think psychological safety is there's no friction, and sometimes that's actually very healthy. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
It is, and I've seen multiple models. I know that not everyone is always comfortable speaking out. Some people are shyer than others. Some people don't want the attention, but do want to have their questions answered. And so one of the models that I really like is an anonymous feedback loop, where anybody within the organization, really anybody at any level, can submit a question or submit a comment anonymously, and that gets filtered up and actually implemented. And this is the key. You can get all the feedback in the world. If you don't do anything with the feedback, if you don't learn from the feedback, then you're not really a learning organization. When we talk about artificial intelligence, and for instance, for those of you who have been working with or experimenting with generative AI, you get this option to say thumbs up or thumbs down. Was this useful? Was this not useful? And the more that we give that feedback, the more these systems learn, just as the more we give feedback to the organization, to the team, with the safety of knowing that this is taken in stride and will be not only listened to, rewarded, but also reincorporated within the organization, within the products and services. All of that is key. It's not just one of these elements. They all have to work together. Now, when I talk about creative friction, this was definitely learned at Much Music and Musique Plus, where, again, we had just so many different types of people. Some had gone to school. I had not gone to school. I literally, as I said earlier, I just kind of pointed and I thought, oh, I can do that. And I was lucky enough that people believed in me. So very, very different types of people in one organization. In this particular case, it was live television. So by the time the cameras went on, we actually had to have it somewhat figured out. And what we had figured out is that we were doing controlled chaos. So this idea was then amplified when I went back to Columbia to finish my degree, and it made me laugh so much. So Professor David Stark is a sociologist, an organizational sociologist at Columbia Business School, and he essentially did wonderful work on Wall Street as well as on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. And what he found is that the most diverse teams, and again, when I talk about diversity, we're not just talking about race, we're not just talking about gender, we're talking about neurodiversity, we're talking about different socioeconomics, different cultures, different types of educations. When you have this incredible mix of people coming together to weigh in on something, you're going to get a lot more dissension, a lot more pushback, a lot more people going, no, 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 I know how to do this. And others are going, yeah, but wait, have you thought about this? And what about that? And what if this other regulation comes in? And so it takes longer to deliberate. But the results mean better productivity. In the case of the stock exchanges, they made more money. People feel more valued. It's more of a team effort. There's more buy-in. People are more likely to be happy when they wake up in the morning because they're contributing something and they can actively feel it. And that's special. And I think that that creative friction then, when applied to our technologies, also makes better technology. So if you involve the populations of interest that you're gearing your AI system towards, in thinking about what the potential uses of the technology could be for those communities, but also what are the potential harms. And you talk to them, you integrate them in that process before you even design the technology itself. And then you take that feedback and you design it. And as you test it out, you bring them in again. And what do you think of this? And is this working? And what are some of the other potential harms or benefits that you can see for your specific groups and cultures? And then you go back and you alpha test and you beta test. And at every stage, you're bringing the communities back for that feedback, getting that positive feedback loop going in. Again, the deliberation takes longer. However, you're going to get better products for more people. And I think that that's really key, especially when we're talking about more and more automated systems.
That's a super inspiring message, and something that I think we all have to kind of, right? Well, but it's also something we all have to kind of keep in mind, right? Like the getting diverse viewpoints takes longer, but it's better in the end. And so I'd like to go back to something I'm personally we're gonna talk about. I'd love to in a second talk about kind of bias and how we deal with that. But one part that you kind of said that kind of tweaked my interest was providing feedback and giving chat GPT kind of, yeah, this answer worked or this answer didn't work. And so this kind of gets to something that I think is going to be one of the big issues for our times, and especially for our organization, which is around privacy. So Juliette, we did a little intro on our organization, but we sit on some incredibly sensitive information about people's health, people's careers. And so how do we balance the idea of privacy and the need for organizations to kind of use the information to kind of achieve their goals? What do you have any thoughts on that sort of idea of where is that line, and how do we negotiate kind of that part?
So we're still all negotiating this. Don't feel like you are behind, Chaz, or anyone who's listening to us. If you haven't used the technology yet, if you're just hearing about it, or if you have, touched upon it and you're like, oh, okay, that's enough for me. Thank you very much. It's okay. It's only been out for, mass audiences since last November. So not even a year yet, first of all. Second of all, none of us actually know the answers to some of the questions. We can start feeling out where this might be going based on a lot of the lawsuits that are coming out, especially against OpenAI, which I won't dive into too deeply. If you're curious about it, it's in the headlines almost on a daily basis. But I think the other key point is that There are different types of regulations that are coming down the pipeline. There's one in Canada. There is talk of one in the United States, and we're very good at having the founders of OpenAI and all manners of big tech to come to DC and hang out in the White House and talk about how we're all going to take responsibility, but we have yet to actually see any real regulation coming out of that. And then there's the European Union and the Artificial Intelligence Act, which we should be seeing by the end of this year. And when we talk about training data, ultimately, there are some privacy issues there. Whether we're training generative AI by scraping the internet, do you want Microsoft and other organizations to make money off of your identity, off of information that could be about you or that potentially you even produced? And how would you even be able to show that that was the case? Sarah Silverman is in court right now trying to do exactly that, along with the class action lawsuit. So this idea of privacy, I think, is much more protected traditionally in Canada than it is in the United States. And I'm hoping in that sense that Canada will be better protected. But the European Union, essentially, the AIA Act is giving different risk threat levels, if you will. And when it comes to chatbots, first off, the chatbot will have to say that it's a chatbot. Anything that's generated by a chatbot will have to say that it was generated by a chatbot as opposed to a human. That's kind of fundamental. But secondly, you talk about privacy, there are also major issues with cybersecurity. So generative AI is pretty easy to hack, which means that if you are trying to create a chatbot around anything health or education related, it's all the more problematic because all of that data is really well protected, even here in the United States. There are just certain lines that I think most of us humans just don't want to cross. And when it comes to the privacy of our kids or the privacy of our patients, our most vulnerable populations, they have to be front and foremost. So when it comes down to the level of the organization, certain organizations are encouraging their employees to dive in, experiment, and if you can come up with something great, fantastic. Maybe we'll use your idea and incorporate it within the way that we operate. Other organizations are banning it completely. And as you and I spoke before today, and I think you had very similar kind of extreme reactions from different organizations. It really depends on the culture and whether they're willing to take risks. But I think that also organizations have reputations. In the United States, they are treated as individuals under the law, which means that, a company like Google has a much bigger reputation to protect than a company like OpenAI that most people had never even heard of before they deployed ChatGPT. And these are all things that I think we have to take into account when we're deciding whether we are going to use these tools on a personal level. How much risk am I willing to take with my personal information? Like if I'm submitting information into the system, either on my behalf or the organization's behalf, it's gone. And how it's going to resurface in somebody else's answer, most of the developers don't even know, let alone, the users. So the question is, are you now inputting trade secrets into, a third-party system that you do not own or have control over? These are major issues. And I could go on and on. I don't want to bore you here, but it's there's a lot
there's nothing boring about it. I mean, for us as we look to use these things, and there is the idea of if we just cut and paste some information into this very friendly little chat thing, it comes back with an answer that's helpful. But as you say, in some circumstances, we don't know what's happening to that. Is it being read by OpenAI? Is it being reused? Will it pop up in someone else's answer? These are things that have happened, and so that's why I think for us, our entire organization is based on the trust that doctors have in us and the trust that governments have that we're going to do the right thing. And so if we abuse that inadvertently, even by using these tools and exposing kind of very sensitive information to these unregulated, it's called OpenAI. for a reason, right? Into these unregulated, uncontrolled environments. That's a problem, and I think that's something we're going to have to wrestle with. That said, who knows where this is going to end up? As you say, there's different laws that we're going to have to figure out, and will we be pulled more in the EU direction, or so if you have a question, I think there's actually like a question spot and then a chat spot. Sorry, I'm just I'm seeing these things pop up. I'm like, yeah, no, I'm on it, Juliette. You're good. I'm just like, so one of the questions that I'd love to dive into is from the gang, and we talked a little bit about bias, and this is something. I mean, gosh, we sit on every medical legal case for the most part that's happened in Canada for the last X number of years. So to think that there's no record of bias in either the medical or legal systems is probably not true. But how do we mitigate bias in this data? And how do we understand that? And so one of the questions is, how do we mitigate bias when working with data? What steps can we do to mitigate this bias? Like, do you have anything practical for us? And then who are the leaders that we can look to as an example? So, very interested in your perspective.
I'll give you a very personal story that I don't usually share, but I do think that it's pertinent in that when I was still living in Canada, I had found a lump in my breast. And I went to the doctor, and the generalist sent me to, a specialist, a gynecologist, who then was to, or at least I thought she was going to send me to go get a mammogram and figure out what was happening. And I was told instead that because I'm a Black woman, and because statistically fewer Black women get breast cancer, that I didn't need a mammogram. And that was that. That was the end of that story. And that just did not sit well with me at all. And I mentioned it to a friend of mine who was in the United States, and he was seeing an oncologist for other reasons. Next thing you know, he just said, listen, just come to my oncologist, that we can get you an appointment tomorrow, which I did. I was terrified. And she did find active cells. And in the end, I did have to have a procedure done, and that would have been completely missed because a doctor was just ill-informed. And it might have been the policy. I have no idea. But what I do know is that the response was based on data, but it didn't necessarily take into account my context, which is, yes, I present as a Black woman, but I'm also mixed. I've got Scottish, I've got German, my mother was French Canadian, and this person didn't ask any of that information about me at all, didn't bring that into what that meant in terms of the statistics that they were citing. So for me, there are many different ways of doing machine learning. I think as part of the machine learning process, we also have to give better context to our data, because our data are people. Right? At the end of the day, they're not just numbers. They represent us as humans. And we need to contextualize all of that to get better answers for more people. And especially when it comes to, negative biases or confirmation bias, the same thing. If you expect to see the same thing, you are more likely to see that thing than if you're more objective about it. So again, that creative friction, bringing in more people to look at things, helps eliminate some of that negative bias. Yeah. But at the same time, I do think that more and more we're also relying on our systems, on our AI systems, to try to monitor the negative biases in our other systems. And so I still think that we need humans in the loop to really get a sense of first off, what are we optimizing for? Is it to save the most number of lives? Is it to make sure that our vulnerable populations aren't falling through the cracks? Like, what are we optimizing for? And that answer will determine what kind of questions and what kinds of systems we're designing.
So first of all, your story makes me almost angry. So and I'm so sorry that happened to you. And as Kara says, it's likely there's bias in the data and is bias in the interpretation. And so going back to the question part, are there any leaders in terms of mitigating bias that we can think of, or that we can look to as we develop our own approaches? Because, gosh, there's bias in our data for sure, and we're just trying to wrap our heads around how do we even deal with that. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
In terms of medical, I don't want to misspeak. So this is, and you know this, Chantz, this is not
No problem.
expertise. I can think of technology companies that are doing it well, but medical practitioners, I don't know. I personally trust the Mayo Clinic because they did help me when I had my own personal issues. And from what I've seen, they really are dedicated to removing a lot of this systematic racial bias that we see. And so I would say it's a starting point. It's a good starting point. But I also suspect that fantastic models are going to be coming out of Canada because of the laws, because of the culture, and because we generally seem to be proud to be multicultural. So I see that as a plus.
We'll do our best. So it's kind of the idea of, make sure that, I love your idea of that our data are people at the end of the day, and kind of keep track of that. And people are imperfect. And so how we collect it, how we use it, there's going to be flaws. And so be aware of that, but also be aware of, at the end of the day, that that number is an entire story of someone and their life. So I love that as a thought. Let's go back to this idea of humans in the loop. So this is something that, to be honest, we're actively thinking about right now in terms of how do we look at kind of exploring these tools. And the idea of, I guess how do we, what is humans in the loop? Maybe let's start there, because that might be a term that some people don't know. And then maybe let's talk a little bit about what that means, and then explore a little bit of accountability and how that goes with having humans in the loop. So maybe I'll leave that, and then yeah.
So humans in the loop, sui generis, is about having human supervision of an AI system, machine learning system, generative AI, all kinds of AI. There are many different forms, and we don't have to necessarily get into that, but the idea that the system, in fact, can replicate itself, is autonomous, does not need human supervision, are all true. However, I am a big proponent of actually having a human checking on our systems to make sure that it's doing the thing that we want it to do. And as we change our minds and decide that we want it to do other things, that we as humans can go back in and either change the algorithm or potentially, create a different system, but ultimately that we're in charge, that we decide as humans on what our technologies will be doing, as opposed to just having more technology supervise our technology. The original title of my book was "Who Watches the Watch Robots?" In other words, we need oversight. We need accountability. In fact, I was in Montreal the day before my book launched on August 14th. And I was at the Montreal Institute for Learning Algorithms, MILA, at the invitation of Yoshio Bengio, who is a preeminent thinker in artificial intelligence. He's one of the granddaddies who won the Turing Prize in 2018. The guy knows what he's talking about. Huh? And he was one of the people that signed an open letter along with hundreds of other AI researchers and practitioners, advising that because generative AI and AI in general is advancing so much faster than they had predicted by decades, that he was suggesting that we take a 6-month moratorium on advanced AI research. The moratorium was up on September 10th. Have we slowed down? No. In fact, what have we done? We've accelerated the whole process. So there needs to be some form of accountability, and what he and his colleagues are recommending is well beyond the local or even national level, but really this international global organization that doesn't even exist yet to have oversight over AI as a whole in the world, because if bad actors get a hold of some of this stuff, it could be very, very bad for humanity. And so the idea there is to protect us all. I don't think that that removes our responsibility as individuals to, grow our data literacy, our digital literacy. You can do it with an organization like this one. You can do it with free courses online. If you're not happy with your job or with the organization or with the questions that you are allowed or not allowed to ask, then there are many new jobs that are now available thanks to artificial intelligence and machine learning, including the wonderful new job of prompt engineering. Yes, you too could ask questions for a living. But again, that human in the loop is the one that's asking the questions, that posing the prompts to the generative AI, as opposed to the generative AI just prompting itself, right? I think that when we talk about human in the loop, there are also, national defense definitions of human in the loop, and that has to do with AI systems for defense. And there, the definitions change on an ongoing basis. So
right. One thing that you made me think of, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, is the idea that even with all of these new tools and availability of data, even how kids, young people are being trained, they're starting to integrate, Python and R into their high school programs. So as an organization that, we've been around for a little bit, and how can we, maybe we can talk a little bit about kind of learning across generations, how organizations can make themselves maybe attractive to people who have these skills, and kind of how do we build that, I guess, that fabric of making sure that we're kind of with the times, and we maintain kind of our skill set with all these new jobs and things that are going on. So maybe let's spend a little bit of time on that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in each one, teach one. When you learn something, teach it to somebody else, right? It's a positive feedback loop. Pay that forward. And it could be a free course on data literacy. It might be, how the next, and I'm telling you this because I know a few people here in the United States that are taking courses. So all of these different regulations, whether we're talking about the ones in Europe, the ones in Canada, potentially the ones in the United States, will require AI auditors. Right now, we don't have any AI auditors, and we're talking about independent AI auditors. So a lot of people are taking courses in that, and I think it's wonderful because it allows, the everyday person to help all of us remain accountable to our systems, to our data, and ultimately to our people. I think that's really great. So these are not things that you can necessarily take in high school or in college right now, but you can literally take through specific organizations that have gone through every single line of the proposed regulation and how you might audit a system in view of those potential regulations. But then I think back to when I was at Columbia, to be able to get into the business school, every person that submitted their application had to know either Python or R, as you mentioned. And if you didn't know these things, they wouldn't even look at your stuff. Like they say, okay, go take a few classes, and then once you have that down, you come back and we'll consider you, but not before then. I'm also seeing high schools here in the United States that are doing that. Why? Well, again, up until last year, all of that made sense because to be able to query our systems, we had to have very specific data science skills. And even though the interfaces were getting better and better, you still had to have a basic knowledge of something like Python. With generative AI, you don't. All of a sudden, it's broken all of these barriers where you can verbally communicate with a system. You can verbally communicate and ask it to code for you. And the code's probably going to be pretty good. And the reason the code's going to probably be pretty good, especially if you're using OpenAI, is because Microsoft bought a database that was created by humans. And so the code is created by humans. It's put together by the AI, but it's actually created by humans. So, again, that human and AI interface, that human in the loop, whether we see it or not, is kind of fundamental to the growth of this stuff. And when I say the growth of this stuff for humanity, for humankind, as opposed to for the tech race or for the arms race.
And it's interesting, kind of the points that, you know, kind of the idea of pay it forward. You know, if you learn something to teach other people.
Oh,
That's
and the other thing is
yeah.
older people. So older people within the organization. Imagine those people that you mentioned that were there for 30 years. I don't know how tech savvy they are. Maybe they're very tech savvy. Maybe they have a
Right.
whole lot of affinity with generative AI. But I can definitely tell you that they have something to teach the new people that are coming in that might have that Python and that R under their belt, that might not know how to navigate an organization,
Right.
let alone how to find champions and how to you know, really add value to the overall culture. So I think that each one teach one is also a geeks and geezers need to get together and supercharge each other.
Oh boy, geeks and geezers.
Yeah.
That's oh, I shudder to think where I fit in that Venn diagram. So what one of the questions we have is maybe a little bit of a left turn, but I want to make sure that we can maybe take a couple of questions from the chat here, and then I want to kind of end on kind of some pieces on data literacy in particular. What about could you maybe comment a little bit on you know, the idea of search optimization and how people are kind of adapting to this new world where maybe search is going to be AI, it's going to be your Bing chats or your bards, and then how can people kind of adapt what they do so that they can actually be found in this new world? So yeah,
How do you
any
stand
thoughts
out?
on adapting, I guess, to this new world where that's now our interface into knowledge? Yeah.
Right. Well, it's very interesting because my publisher for the AI Dilemma specifically asked, okay, can you please like create a website for the book so that people can find it more readily and have certain sections that kind of describe what the book's about, what your background is, the typical stuff. What I did not see coming was they're like, and don't bother doing any SEO around it because SEO doesn't work the way SEO used to since generative AI is out. And I'm like, oh, that piqued my curiosity. I hadn't thought about that. I don't know honestly, I don't know anything about SEO, but what I was told is that in the past, you would go and get a specialist that would optimize your site with keywords. And that now, really, you were much better served to go to generative AI to figure out what those SEO keywords were and then have it write the copy for you so that you essentially it's a one-stop shop. Again, I am not the expert on SEO. I'm not the expert on any kind of marketing optimization at all, and I apologize for not.
No, but what's super interesting about that is even for a book that was published so recently, the fact that they're already talking about you need to optimize so you be found by generative AI is kind of an indication of how quickly things are changing.
Yeah.
That's oof, man, we better start moving. So maybe what I'll end on, we've got I think, you know, just a few minutes left, maybe 5 minutes or so, is we kind of started this on the idea of like one of the, you know, this idea of data literacy, and we covered a whole bunch of awesome things that maybe our AI principles will be our data, our people, you know, each one teach one, and geeks and geezers, power to them. I'm not too sure, but maybe that's where we'll end up. But I'd love to maybe end on, you've talked a lot about questions, and maybe the superpower in this new age of data literacy is about asking questions, and so curiosity, and then communicating that. So maybe let's just end with kind of like a little chat on how can people, you know, if curiosity is the superpower, how can you develop that muscle? What are some ways that we can make sure that we foster and encourage curiosity?
Cross section of different people in your life, different kinds of people. Same thing as the creative friction, right? If you're always with the same group and we all think alike, then you're not generating a whole lot of curiosity there. It's more like the confirmation bias, right? You're always going to see the same thing. And so diverse, like mix it up, mix up. And, you know, if you're not in a position to do that because the entire community around you is just the community where you live and there's no changing that, we have this amazing thing called the internet where you can actually connect to all kinds of people. I know. And a friend of mine was also instrumental in pointing out, and this is well before I got into social technology or machine learning, but that if you want to shake it up, if you really want to like get into a different headspace, do something difficult. For them, it was about learning how to pilot helicopters. So this was somebody who had done all kinds of different things in their life. And so what's difficult? Well, I'm going to learn how to pilot in my 50s. And for him, it was about learning the technical skills, but also you have to be able to trust your intuition simultaneously while you're balancing a broom upside down. So imagine that. That's why I want to do it, because it destabilizes you. It pushes you out of your comfort zone. And I think that a lot of these tools do that for us. Make it your superpower. Go for it. You've got absolutely nothing to lose in experimenting, especially if you're surrounded by others that are also experimenting, but in a safe way. So some of the guidelines we talked about, again, do not enter your own personal data in there or your organizations. Not unless like you've all decided that you're going to do this together. That's kind of key. And also one more thing, really, really important.
No, we got time. Yeah.
It hallucinates. So it makes stuff up. Keep that in mind as you're experimenting, even if you're using your digital literacy and your common sense. And there's something that doesn't seem quite right. It's probably not. People have used this stuff to introduce me on stage. And I don't know that they just didn't read it beforehand, but it's all of a sudden it's coming out of the mouth. Juliette Powell, the next female Elon Musk? Like, you know that
hey, why not?
So these tools hallucinate. We need humans like you to ask it better questions and to check on it.
I love it. So we'll end with make sure that you fact check and you are accountable for what comes out of your mouth, no matter how it was generated, whether it's ChatGPT or any other tool. And then one of the key takeaways, I think, is our next team building event will be learning how to fly a helicopter. That seems like that's the core conclusion. So sounds expensive, but probably worth it, right? So there we go.
Helicopter pilots are Canadian, so maybe a little less expensive.
All right, so we're coming up to the end of the hour. I'll leave any sort of final thoughts or comments to you, Juliette. But I will say, no, I'll let you do a little bit. But yeah, just a few little thoughts, and then we'll wrap it up.
I just feel bad because first, merci à vous, Pascal. Je me sens tellement mal que j'ai pas parlé en français. C'est un événement en anglais, mais j'apprécie que vous soyez ici. Thank you so much for all of you who joined us, no matter where you are in your life or where you are in the world. I am so happy to have had this opportunity to connect with you, and thank you so much, Chaz, for having me into your organization, for trusting in me enough to, to from VJ to machine learning expert.
Oh, this is great. I will say that I'm so pleased that you're able to come and join us, and I've learned a lot, and I've taken copious notes. And so thank you for spending a little bit of time with us. We weren't able to do a fireside chat, but maybe if we do this again, we'll figure out at least to have like matching backgrounds, so that it can be like the same fireplace in the background or something like that. So anyways, so with that, we'll draw it to a close. But again, thank you, Juliette. Really appreciate it. And I don't know if you have your chat open, but you can actually see all of the thank yous and all of the feedback from all the people who've been listening. So
I had it open, but I hadn't scrolled. Holy, there's a lot more there. Mais merci, thank you. Oh, that is so. Wow, thank you. Like again, you can't tell that I'm blushing, but I'm deeply blushing.
Okay. Well, thanks again, and we'll call it there. Okay. So take care, everyone.